The Syrian sand burned white under a noon sun, and the column of riders coming across it shimmered like a moving wall of glass. Zenobia rode at the front. Behind her, thousands of cataphracts, men sheathed in iron scales, their horses armored to the hooves, caught the light and threw it back across the desert. You could see her army from 3 miles out before you could count a single rider. She wore a commander's helmet. She carried herself like a pharaoh. For a handful of years in the 3rd century AD, she controlled more Roman land than Rome did, and clerks in every eastern province said her name the way men say the name of something they hope is sleeping. 2 centuries earlier, in a palace that smelled of lotus oil and burning wicks, Cleopatra reclined inside the city that housed the greatest library on earth. She spoke 9 languages. She walked among her people as Isis made flesh. Goddess of magic, goddess of mothers, she had already survived 1 Roman civil war and placed herself at the heart of the next. She did not play politics. She was politics. And she watched Rome with the steady eyes of someone who had already read the board. These women were not standing at the edge of power. They sat on its throne. And to Rome, that was the offense. The empire was not only legions and roads, it was theater, public, ritualized, soaked in cruelty. The ceremony had a name, the triumph, and it had a particular appetite for queens. A defeated king could be killed quickly, his death buried in a line of state record. But a foreign queen, stripped of her royal cloth, bound in chains, dragged through Roman streets while the crowd howled. That was a message, aimed at every conquered people watching. A reminder of what Rome did to women who tried to rule without its permission. We are going to follow 3 of them. Boudica, queen of the Iceni, whose faith in Roman law was answered with a whip across her back. Cleopatra, the strategist who understood the machine so completely, she chose to steal its prize before it could be paraded. And Zenobia, whose defiance was so absolute that Rome itself could not agree on what they did to her in the end. Before we go further, drop a comment below telling us what city and country you're watching from. We read every one of them. And if you haven't yet, take a moment to subscribe and stand with this project. You're watching Romanus, your home of the Roman Empire on YouTube. Winter, AD 60. In the flat country that today carries the names Norfolk and Suffolk, the Iceni kingdom held its breath. Not silence, born of peace. Silence the way a house goes still in the seconds before the front door splinters inward. The land itself was a long, shallow basin of fen and heath, cut by the slow rivers that drained east into the cold gray water of the North Sea. The Iceni had thrived in it for generations. Their coinage, silver units bearing the horse and the boar, moved through markets as far west as the Severn estuary. Their horse handlers were famous. Their territory included the salt pans at the coast and the iron deposits at the inland edge of the fens. King Prasutagus had ruled them for years as a client of Rome, threading the needle between his tribe and the empire crouched at his shoulder. He had been one of 11 kings who, according to the inscription on the triumphal arch of Claudius at Rome, formally submitted after the invasion of AD 43. He had kept his throne by playing dead in the political sense, visible enough to satisfy Rome, useful enough to be left in place. He had managed it. Just. And as his body began to fail him, he sat down to do one last clever thing. He wrote a will. The document named his 2 daughters and the Emperor Nero as co-heirs to his kingdom and his private treasury. In Prasutagus's mind, this was a masterstroke. Hand Rome a portion voluntarily. Shield his daughters with the rest. die knowing his bloodline still had thrones to sit on. He had studied the empire. He understood its hunger. He believed that if he fed it on his own terms, it would let his family keep the plate. He was wrong, and the wrongness of it would light 3 cities on fire. Nero was 23 years old when the will reached Rome. He had already murdered his mother Agrippina the year before, in AD 59, drowning her in the Bay of Naples after a poisoned roof failed to do the work. He was not in the habit of honoring inconvenient bequests. The court around him, Seneca writing speeches, Burrus commanding the guard, the freedman Pallas still controlling chunks of imperial finance, operated on the principle that any unclaimed wealth in the provinces belonged to the emperor by default. Roman officials did not open Prasutagus' will as a partnership offer. They opened it as a property notice. Under Roman law, a client kingdom did not pass quietly to native heirs. It folded back into Rome at the king's death unless the empire chose otherwise. And the empire almost never chose otherwise, because choosing otherwise meant walking away from money. Prasutagus' last act became, in the procurator's office, a routine memo confirming that the Iceni were now Roman administrative territory. The credit trap closed at the same hour. Seneca himself, the philosopher, the tutor of Nero, the writer of essays on the virtue of restraint, had, according to Cassius Dio, lent 40 million sesterces to British nobles at interest, and now called the whole sum in at once. The loans had been pushed on the British aristocracy for years as a slow-acting trap. They were due now, in coin, with no extensions. The man assigned to enforce all of this was Decianus Catus, procurator of the province. His brief was revenue. His instruments were soldiers with swords and soldiers with ledgers, and in his hands the two were the same instrument. When his agents rode into the Iceni heartland after Prasutagus' death in AD 60 or 61, they brought the full apparatus of Roman authority with them, and they used every piece of it. The royal residence at Venta Icenorum. The site now lies just south of modern Norwich. A flat green field where you can still trace the outline of the later Roman town in the grass at the right hour of the afternoon, was occupied. Centurions walked the corridors pulling ornaments from the walls, hauling out furniture, listing horses and cattle and grain. Iceni nobles, who had taken Roman loans, were ordered to repay everything, immediately. In coin, most of them did not have. Tacitus writes that the leading men of the Iceni had their ancestral lands seized as if their tribe had been beaten in open war. Relatives of the late king were treated as slaves. This was not greed running loose. This was a system performing its function. Boudica was the queen, Prasutagus' widow. We do not know her exact age. We have Tacitus and Cassius Dio, who tell us she was tall, with hair the color of copper that fell to her hips, a harsh voice, and a stare that Roman men found uncomfortable to meet. Dio adds that she wore a great golden torque at her throat and a tunic of many colors fastened with a brooch, and that when she spoke in public, she carried a spear. She stood before the procurator's agents and said no. What followed is recorded in Tacitus's annals, written about 50 years after the events from sources that included people who had been alive when it happened. Tacitus does not look away. Boudica was seized and flogged in public, her royal dress torn from her, her back opened like that of a slave caught thieving. Her 2 daughters, whose names Roman writers did not bother to preserve, were raped by Roman soldiers. Sit with that for a moment. Not as a general statement about Roman cruelty, as a specific operational choice. A centurion does not flog the widow of a client king on instinct. He does not authorize the rape of royal daughters because his men are restless. What happened in that hall was approved. deliberate, and meant to be witnessed. It was a message written on skin, because skin keeps the message longer than parchment. The sentence read, "The royalty you wore was a costume we let you borrow. We are taking it back. You are not a queen. You are a body standing on land that belongs to us." It was the triumph in miniature. Rome's great ceremony of public destruction required the foreign ruler to stand there, exposed, broken down from sovereign to spectacle while a crowd watched. Decianus Catus ran the same procedure inside the Iceni royal compound with no parade and no spectators from the forum. He performed the reduction in the same grammar Rome would use later in stone. The bared back, the bound wrist, the violation witnessed by enough mouths that the story would carry. It was meant to make the rest of Britain quiet for a generation. It did the opposite. The Iceni did not collapse into obedience. They detonated, and they pulled their neighbors with them, the Trinovantes to the south, who carried a list of their own complaints against the Roman colony at Camulodunum. Roman veterans had been seizing Trinovantian land for years under a program called deductio, where retired legionaries were settled on confiscated soil as both reward and garrison. The temple of the deified Claudius stood at the center of the colony, an enormous stone announcement that Rome had come and was not leaving. The Trinovantes had been compelled to pay for its construction. They had been compelled to serve as priests in its cult, financing the very ceremony of their own subjugation. There were omens, too, in the days before the rising. Tacitus records them in the dry tone of a man unwilling to commit to belief, but unwilling to leave them out. The statue of victory at Camulodunum turned itself around on its pedestal, as if to flee. Strange cries were heard in the empty Senate house of the colony. A blood-like tide ran up the Thames. Phantoms were seen in the estuary, and figures of ruined buildings appeared offshore. These stories spread through the colony in the weeks before the attack. The veterans laughed at them. The native serving women carried them home in the dark. When Boudica lifted her standard, when this flogged, stripped, violated woman stood in front of assembled warriors and opened her mouth, she found an audience already on fire. Dio reports the speech she gave. She released a hair from the folds of her tunic and watched the direction it ran, and the warriors read the omen and roared. She invoked the goddess Andraste, the Briton war goddess of victory. Her private humiliation struck a forest that had been seasoning into kindling for 20 years. Camulodunum went first, modern Colchester. The colony had no walls. The Romans had never bothered to build any, because who would dare come at them? And when the Britons arrived, the veterans and settlers who had spent years pushing native families off their fields learned the answer to that question in a single afternoon. They sent word to Decianus Catus, who dispatched 200 poorly armed auxiliaries from London. 200, against tens of thousands. The colonists barricaded themselves inside the temple of Claudius, a stone box with bronze doors raised on a high podium, the only defensible structure in the city. They held out for 2 days. They had no food. They had no water. The roof came down on them on the second night, when the Britons piled brushwood against the doors and fired it. The podium of that temple still survives, buried beneath the Norman castle the Plantagenets later built on top of it. You can walk down into the vaults and put your hand on the stones that the survivors crouched against in their last hour. The city burned so thoroughly that archaeologists today can find Boudica's destruction layer in any dig across the modern town center. A band of red-orange oxidized soil and ash about 2 meters beneath the pavement, packed with broken pottery, collapsed wall daub, scorched Samian ware imported from Gaul, and the occasional shard of burned bone. Carbonized dates and figs have been recovered from it. Luxury goods from the eastern Mediterranean, eaten and stored by Roman colonists who never expected the night to come for them. That stripe of burned earth is her signature. The 9th Legion Hispana, the nearest Roman force, marched south from its fortress at Longthorpe, near modern Peterborough, to relieve Camulodunum. Its infantry was annihilated in open ground somewhere along the route, ambushed in country the Britons knew, and the legionaries did not. The legate, Quintus Petilius Carialis, escaped only because he had cavalry and rode hard. He survived the day and would survive the decade. 8 years later, he would be governor of Britain himself, and decades after that, he would be father-in-law to Tacitus, which is one of the reasons we have the account we have. This was not a border scuffle. A major Roman military formation had been destroyed by a tribal coalition, and the news of it ran across the province like fire across dry grass. Decianus Catus, the procurator who had started all of it, fled to Gaul as soon as the reports reached him. He was never punished. He simply vanished from the record, a small bureaucratic ghost. Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, the governor, was at the far northwest corner of Britain, on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, burning out the Druid sanctuaries when the dispatches reached him. Tacitus describes that scene too. The Britons lined the far shore in dark robes. Black-clad women ran between the warriors with torches like furies. Druids stood with their hands raised toward the sky, screaming curses across the water. The Roman troops froze on the beach until their officers shook them out of it. Then they crossed. They cut down everyone on the shore. They burned the sacred groves where the Druids had performed their rites, and, Tacitus reports, hung captives from the trees. That was the work Suetonius was finishing when the rider from the east arrived. He moved south with a speed the sources call extraordinary, his cavalry pushing across the spine of Britain along the road, later called Watling Street. He could not save Londinium. Londinium, London, was already a real city, less than 20 years old, but growing fast on the north bank of the Thames. A bridge crossed the river roughly where London Bridge stands today. The wharves below it handled grain, wine, oil, fine pottery from Gaul. The streets were timber-framed, the roofs of thatch, the warehouses packed with goods waiting for distribution inland. Suetonius arrived ahead of his infantry, looked at the ground, looked at the troops he had, and made the calculation a Roman commander was trained to make. He could not hold the city. A lost battle here would lose the province. He ordered everyone capable of moving to leave with his column and abandoned everyone else. The civilians who stayed behind, the elderly, the sick, those who refused to believe the rumors until the smoke was visible from the bridge, were killed when Boudica's army arrived. Dio's description of what happened to the noblest of the Roman women is the kind of passage Roman editors would later try to soften. They were impaled lengthwise on sharpened stakes after their breasts had been cut off and sewn to their mouths. The sacrifices, Dio writes, were carried out in the sacred grove of Andraste, with feasting and lewd behavior afterward. Whether every detail is true, or whether some are atrocity literature meant to justify what Rome did next, the archaeology confirms the underlying fact. In places along the Walbrook stream, which then ran through the center of Londinium, excavators have pulled human skulls from the silt, many of them showing blade marks. Londinium burned. The same red destruction layer reappears beneath the modern city, in excavations from the city and from Southwark. The same orange horizon, the same chemistry of total fire. Then Verulamium, modern St. Albans, went the same way. It was a Briton city, a tribal capital of the Catuvellauni that had been promoted to municipium status under Roman rule, and that promotion was reason enough for Boudica's coalition to add it to the list. Tacitus puts the dead across the three cities at 70,000 Romans and Roman allies. The number is probably inflated. Roman historians did not count corpses for a census, but the archaeology will not be argued with. 3 major settlements reduced to ash inside one campaign season. Whatever the true figure, the scale was real. Then the wind changed. Suetonius picked his ground with the cold patience that made Roman battlefield doctrine so murderous when properly applied. The exact location of the final engagement is still argued. Sites along Watling Street between Mancetter and High Cross, others near Towcester have been proposed, and no spade has settled it. But the shape of the battlefield Tacitus describes is precise. The Romans took position in a narrow defile, a valley with wooded slopes pressing in on both sides, a plain opening before them. The forest at their backs blocked any flanking attack. The narrowness funneled the British charge into a front no wider than the legions could hold with formation rather than numbers. He had 10,000 men. The 14th Legion Gemina, vexallations of the 20th, auxiliaries from the frontier garrisons. He had ordered the 2nd Augusta to march up from Exeter, but its prefect Poienius Posthumus refused the command. That refusal would weigh on Posthumus until the day after the battle, when he heard the result and ran himself onto his own sword in his quarters. Boudica had the larger force by a margin the sources put at 10-1 or worse, almost certainly inflated, but pointing at a real disparity. She also had something the Romans did not have. She had the certainty of victory. She had burned 3 cities. She had erased a legion. She had behind her a people who had been pushed past every limit they thought they had, and discovered, on the far side, that they could do things they had not known were possible. Her warriors lined up on the plain. Behind them, close enough to see the action, their wagons were drawn up in a long crescent, with their wives and children sitting on top, ready to watch the end of Roman Britain. Tacitus gives both commanders speeches before the engagement. Boudica rode along the front of her line in a chariot, her 2 daughters with her, and called out to the warriors that she fought not as a queen avenging her kingdom, but as one of them, a woman avenging her body and her children. Suetonius told his legionaries to ignore the noise and the threats. Among the enemy, there were more women than fighting men. The closeness of those wagons killed her army. Tacitus describes the Roman attack with the brevity of a man who has read the dispatch. The legions threw their pila, the heavy javelins, weighted with iron shanks designed to bend on impact so they could not be thrown back. At close range in a single mass volley, then advanced in wedge, shields locked, the gladius working underneath. The gladius was made for this exact situation. Short, stabbing. Efficient inside a tight formation where a slashing weapon has no room to move. The Britons carried longer iron swords that needed space to swing. The Romans refused to give them an inch. The auxiliary cavalry, lances couched, took the flanks. The British line cracked. When it cracked, the wall of wagons behind it became a trap. The warriors trying to fall back collided with their own families. There was nowhere to go. What followed was not combat. It was a methodical execution conducted at sword's length until the field was finished. Tacitus says the Romans killed everything that moved, including the draft animals harnessed to the wagons, which lay in heaps among the dead. He puts the British dead at 80,000, another round number from a tradition that liked round numbers. Roman losses, he claims, were 400, but the meaning is unmistakable. The revolt did not end in retreat. It ended in the near-total destruction of the army that had carried it. Boudica was not taken on that field. Her end depends on which historian you read. Tacitus says poison. Cassius Dio says she fell sick and died, and her people gave her a costly burial. The mechanism varies. The outcome is identical. She was gone before any Roman could close a hand on her arm. Deliberate poison or genuine fever, the result was the same. Her body never reached Roman custody. The location of her grave has been hunted for centuries, under Platform 10 at King's Cross Station, under a mound in Hampstead Heath, under half a dozen barrows in the Midlands, and never found. That detail is not a footnote. Think about what Suetonius would have done with her breathing. A queen who had burned 3 Roman cities, killed 70,000 people, and erased a legion. Her triumph would have been the imperial event of a generation. She would have walked the Via Sacra in chains while the city of Rome howled its relief into her face. She already knew what that performance looked like. She had stood through a private version of it in her own royal hall while a centurion's whip opened her back. She knew exactly what Roman power did when it had a body to work with. She gave them no body. Her death closes the first chapter, but it does not close the argument. Because everything that happened to Boudica, the flogging, the rape of her daughters, the cities, the shield wall, the poison, is the machine speaking its full sentence from start to finish. Rome did not arrive in the Iceni kingdom to deliver justice. It arrived to extract value. When the queen blocked the extraction, the system used the only instruments it knew how to use: physical degradation, public shaming, the reduction of sovereignty to skin and bone. And in doing so, the system manufactured the one thing it could not control: a woman with nothing left to lose, an army willing to walk into fire behind her. When that army shattered against the shields on Watling Street, she still found one last way to refuse the script. They wanted her alive, bound, weeping, walking in their parade. She swallowed something, or she let the fever take her, and left Rome holding a story it could never finish writing. Every Roman historian who picked up the Boudican revolt had to admit she had not been defeated in the way Rome required its enemies to be defeated. She was not displayed in chains. She was not paraded. She was a whole in the official record. A war that had to be explained, justified, contextualized, because if you looked at it without the imperial gloss, what you saw was a Roman official torturing a queen and setting half of Britain on fire as the consequence. Tacitus, a Roman senator, a man who genuinely believed in the empire, still could not bring himself to soften what Decianus Catus had done. The flogging is named for what it was. The rape of the daughters is named. He notes that Suetonius's vengeance afterward was so severe that Nero sent a new procurator, Julius Classicianus, to investigate, and Classicianus's report was harsh enough that the freedman Polyclitus was dispatched from Rome to mediate. Suetonius was eventually recalled. The tombstone of Classicianus survives in the British Museum. Pulled out of the Riverside Wall of London in the 19th century, the inscription still legible. He is buried in the city Boudica burned. But Tacitus was an outlier. Most of Rome's commemorative apparatus filed Boudica's war under rebellion suppressed, the routine ledger entry the empire generated along its margins. The land was retained. The Iceni were broken. The red ash layer under Colchester and London was paved over, and new Roman cities rose on top of it. What never got paved over was the story. Boudica survived her war. She survived the shield wall. She survived the slaughter on the plain. She survived centuries of Roman silence. She survived because she had refused the part Rome had written for her: the chained queen, the weeping captive, the body on the parade route. And in refusing it, she had made herself impossible to erase. You cannot put on display what you do not own. She became the warning Rome could not stop repeating. Every time a Roman historian named the revolt, he had to name its cause. Every time he named the cause, he had to name what the procurator had done: the flogging, the daughters, the queen who walked out of that hall and came back with fire. The machine had built its own ghost. Before we cross over to Cleopatra, a woman who studied that ghost so closely she turned it into a strategy. A word to those of you watching right now who want to be more than spectators to this history. There is an inner circle around this channel. We call it the Praetorian Guard. If you have been with Romanus long enough to feel the weight of what we do, the digging, the rebuilding of these scenes, the refusal to flatten them into easy lessons, you already know this kind of work costs something to make at this level. The Praetorian Guard is how you stand watch over it. Members get early access to new videos and a place inside a community that takes this history seriously. Find the join button below this video. Take your post. Boudica refused to let Rome own her story. Help us keep the stories that matter from being buried again. Because what comes next is the story of a woman who read Rome's playbook more carefully than almost any Roman ever did. She watched what happened to queens who fought the machine head-on. She watched what happened to queens who tried to negotiate with it. And then she made a choice no one in the Mediterranean world had seen coming. A choice that would force the most powerful man on earth to chase her into a tomb to make sure she could not finish what she had started. 3 centuries before Zenobia ever lifted a lance over Syrian sand, a woman in Alexandria was doing something more dangerous than raising an army. She was reading Rome the way an engineer reads a blueprint. Cleopatra VII was born around 69 BC into a dynasty in slow collapse. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt since one of Alexander's generals carved off the richest piece of the conquered world and turned it into a Greek kingdom on the Nile. They inherited his ambition and his treasury. They did not inherit his battlefield instincts. 2.5 centuries of palace intrigue, sibling marriages, and assassinations had thinned the family to a court of poisoners. By the time Cleopatra was small enough to be carried through palace corridors, her family's survival rested on Roman goodwill, the most expensive commodity in the Mediterranean. Her father, Ptolemy XIII, called Auletes, the flute player, by subjects who did not respect him, spent staggering sums bribing Roman senators to keep his crown. He paid Julius Caesar himself 6,000 talents in 59 BC for formal recognition as a friend and ally of Rome. He took on debt at ruinous interest to the financier Gaius Rabirius Posthumus, who eventually came to Alexandria himself to recover the loans and was installed as Egypt's chief revenue officer at sword point until the Alexandrians chased him out of the city in a riot. Auletes watched Rome annex Cyprus in 58 BC. He watched his brother, the king of that island, drink poison rather than be deported to Italy in chains. He understood what Cleopatra would learn early. Egypt's independence was not a fixed condition. It was a daily negotiation with a creditor who held legions. Cleopatra absorbed all of it from inside the palace at Alexandria, a city of marble and sea light, its great pharos throwing fire from the harbor mouth at night, its Mausoleon holding the largest library on earth, its streets running in a grid laid out by Alexander's architect Dinocrates. The palace district ran along the eastern harbor on a finger of land called Lochias. From its windows you could see the lighthouse standing 400 feet above the waves, white limestone in the day, an oil-fed beacon at night, visible from 30 miles at sea. The corridors smelled of papyrus, lamp oil, and the salt that came in off the eastern harbor on the morning wind. She studied in rooms where the floors were inlaid with Nile scenes in colored stone. Plutarch reports she spoke 9 languages: Ethiopian, Troglodyte, Hebrew, Arabic, Syrian, Median, Parthian, the dialects of the Egyptian countryside, and her own Greek. She was, as far as the record shows, the first Ptolemy in nearly 3 centuries to bother learning the language of the people her family ruled. Her ancestors had required translators. She required none. A queen who speaks to a priest of Ptah in his own tongue commands a loyalty that no Greek-speaking governor can buy. She was tutored by a court philosopher named Philostratus and, according to later tradition, by the scholar Sosigenes of Alexandria. The astronomer Caesar would later borrow to redesign the Roman calendar. She was not sentimental about power. When her co-rule with her brother Ptolemy XIII fractured in 49 BC, his faction, led by the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the rhetoric tutor Theodotus of Chios, drove her out of Alexandria. She was 20. She crossed the eastern desert and raised troops along the Syrian border, recruiting from the Arab phylarchs and the Jewish military settlers at Pelusium. She was already at the head of an army when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in October of 48 BC, chasing the wreckage of his rival Pompey across the Mediterranean. Pompey, fleeing Pharsalus, had landed off the Egyptian coast, hoping for sanctuary. Theodotus arranged his murder before he stepped onto the beach. The argument the tutor used to convince Ptolemy XIII has survived in Plutarch's account, an icy little phrase, "A dead man does not bite." Pompey was rowed ashore by Achillas and a former Roman officer named Septimius, who had once served under him. Septimius stabbed him in the back as he stood up in the boat. His head was struck off. His body was rolled out on the sand and left for the tide. When Caesar came ashore at Alexandria a few days later, Pothinus presented him with Pompey's severed head wrapped in a cloth, along with his signet ring. Caesar, who had fought Pompey for nearly 20 years, turned his face away and wept. He took only the ring. Cleopatra read the moment from 100 miles away. Caesar was in a hostile city, surrounded by a court that had just murdered his rival in a way that insulted him personally. His force reduced to 2 understrength legions and a small bodyguard, the Alexandrian mob already throwing stones at his men in the streets. He needed a local partner. He needed legitimacy. He needed Egypt's grain reserves and the 4,000 talents Auletes still owed Rome. She was barred from the palace by her brother's men, so she had herself smuggled in. The story, told by Plutarch from sources who had spoken to people present, has been polished by 20 centuries into legend. A loyal Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus rowed her at dusk across the great harbor in a small boat. She concealed herself inside a long sack. Plutarch's word is stromatodesmos, a bag of the kind used to bind bedding. And Apollodorus carried her on his shoulder past Roman sentries at the palace gate, through the corridors, into Caesar's apartments. The bag was opened on the floor. A young woman, 21 years old, climbed out and stood in front of the most powerful man in the world. She gave him what he needed. Their relationship produced a son the following summer, born in Alexandria in June of 47 BC. She named him Ptolemy Caesar. The Alexandrians called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. She presented him publicly as Caesar's heir, and she carried him through the streets in the arms of a wet nurse so the population could see his face. Caesar backed her. The Alexandrian War lasted into early 47 BC and nearly killed him. He was besieged in the palace district for months. When his men torched the Egyptian fleet at the docks, the fire jumped to warehouses near the royal quarter, and ancient sources blame this fire for the loss of a section of the library's holdings, though scholars still argue which buildings burned. At one point, Caesar swam for his life across the harbor, holding important documents above the water with one hand, his purple cloak floating behind him as a marker that Egyptian skirmishers used to throw javelins at him. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during the final pursuit, the golden armor he wore dragging him down into the silt at Memphis. Pothinus was executed by Caesar. Achilles was murdered by his own officers. Theodotus fled. He surfaced years later in Asia Minor and was hunted down by Brutus, who crucified him for the murder of Pompey. That left one sibling, Iceni IV, Cleopatra's younger sister, perhaps 15 years old at the start of the war, who had escaped from the palace, joined the Egyptian forces and been proclaimed queen by the army when Ptolemy III drowned. She had ordered Achilles killed and replaced him with her own tutor, the eunuch Ganymedes, who proved a surprisingly competent commander. She was captured at the end of the war and sent to Rome to wait. In September of 46 BC, in Caesar's quadruple triumph, Iceni walked in chains through the Roman Forum. She was perhaps 17 by then. Appian and Dio both record the reaction of the crowd. The Roman mob, accustomed to watching beaten generals and barbarian chieftains shuffle past in iron, fell silent at the sight of her. A young princess, a girl by Roman standards. The chains on her wrists were heavier than her arms. The route ran from the Campus Martius around the Palatine, through the Velabrum, into the Forum, ending at the Capitoline Temple of Jupiter. At the foot of that hill, defeated leaders were customarily strangled in the Tullianum, a circular underground chamber whose ceiling is the floor of the room above, whose only entrance is a hole in that ceiling through which prisoners were lowered by rope. The Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix had been strangled there earlier that same morning, after 6 years in a Roman cell. Iceni was not strangled. The crowd's discomfort had registered. Even Caesar, watching from his triumphal chariot painted with cinnabar, his face reddened to mimic the terracotta of Jupiter's statue, sensed the misfire. She was spared. She was sent under guard to Ephesus, given sanctuary at the Temple of Artemis, and lived there another 5 years before Mark Antony, at Cleopatra's insistence, had her dragged from the temple steps by Roman soldiers and killed in 41 BC. The murder of an asylum seeker on the steps of one of the most sacred shrines in Asia Minor would be remembered for a long time. Cleopatra was in Rome that day in 46 BC. Caesar had installed her in his suburban villa across the Tiber, in the gardens that would later become the Trastevere Quarter. She watched her sister walk past in iron. She watched the Roman crowd watch. She catalogued every face. The triumph wanted a queen in chains, but the triumph also carried a risk. The machine could overcook its own message. Pity could rise where dominance was meant to land. Rome wanted relief and supremacy from its crowds, not aversion. She filed the lesson. Then Caesar was murdered on the Ides of March, 44 BC, and her entire strategic position evaporated in the time it took 23 knives to find his body. She left Rome within weeks, sailing from Ostia in a private vessel. She returned to Alexandria. She consolidated. Her younger brother and second husband, Ptolemy XIV, an adolescent of 15, died shortly after her return. Josephus says she poisoned him. The sources do not argue. She elevated Caesarion to co-ruler at the age of 3. She watched the Roman world tear itself in half across the Mediterranean. When Octavian and Mark Antony split the empire at the Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BC, Antony took the east. He was a charismatic field commander, popular with the legions, married to Octavian's sister Octavia for political binding. He needed money and Eastern legitimacy for the campaign he was planning against Parthia. The campaign that would, if successful, vault him over Octavian in the eyes of Rome and avenge the disastrous defeat of Crassus at Carrhae a generation earlier, where 7 eagles of the legions had been lost. Egypt had the money. Cleopatra had the legitimacy. He summoned her to Tarsus in southern Cilicia in 41 BC to explain her conduct during the recent wars, when she had been accused of supplying the assassins under their commander Cassius. Her arrival is described by Plutarch with the precision of a man working from eyewitness reports, possibly through his own great-grandfather Nicarchus, who had served Antony and left family memoirs. Her royal barge came up the Cydnus River to the city, its stern overlaid with beaten gold, sails dyed with Tyrian purple at 20,000 denarii a pound, oars of silver moving in time to flutes, harps, and pipes. She lay on the deck beneath a canopy spun with gold thread, dressed as Aphrodite. Boys costumed as Cupids fanned her with peacock feathers. Her women, dressed as Nereids and Graces, worked the rigging in choreographed motion. The scent of burning frankincense reached the city before the barge did. The crowds of Tarsus poured out of the agora to the riverbank to see her. Antony, sitting in the public square waiting to receive her in his tribunal, found himself addressing empty benches. She did not come ashore to him. She received him on her barge. He came to her. She served him a dinner under a canopy lit by hundreds of lamps, arranged in geometric patterns on the deck. And Plutarch notes that Antony, who fancied himself a man of culture, was so dazzled by the display that he could not speak. Every element of that entrance was information. She was not a defendant summoned to answer a charge. She was a goddess granting an audience to a Roman general. Antony understood. He was a man who could read theater. Their alliance became the spine of Eastern Mediterranean politics for the next decade. She bore him 3 children. The twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born in 40 BC, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, born in 36 BC. In 34 BC, after Antony returned from a partially salvaged Parthian campaign, he had lost 20,000 men in the retreat through Armenia, an army wrecked by snow, dysentery, and Parthian horse archers. He staged the ceremony Roman propagandists would never let him live down. The donations of Alexandria. In the great gymnasium of the city, on a silver dais raised before tens of thousands of Alexandrians, Antony seated himself on a golden throne beside a second throne, where Cleopatra sat dressed in the robes of Isis, a sheath of pleated linen, the vulture headdress of the goddess, the sistrum in her hand. He distributed kingdoms to their children. Alexander Helios, 6 years old, dressed as a Persian king with the upright tiara, received Armenia, Media, and Parthia, territories he did not yet control. Cleopatra Selene, his twin, was given Cyrenaica. Ptolemy Philadelphus, 2 years old, dressed in Macedonian boots and cloak, was named king of Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. Caesarion, now 13, was proclaimed the legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar, which made him, by blood and law, a direct rival to Octavian's claim on Caesar's name. Octavian heard the news in Rome and went to work. He was, by any measure, the most effective propagandist the ancient world produced. He did not need to defeat Antony in the field if he could defeat him in the Roman imagination first. He commissioned poets, Virgil, Horace, Propertius, who would, over the next 2 decades, write Cleopatra into the literature of the West as the Eastern queen who threatened Rome with her serpents and her gods. He portrayed Antony as a Roman general gone soft, drugged on Eastern wine, kneeling before a foreign woman, ready to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria. He worked the symbolism of Octavia, the abandoned Roman wife, his own sister, into every speech. She had remained in Antony's house in Rome, raising not only her own children by him, but his children by his previous wife Fulvia, refusing to be evicted even after Antony formally divorced her in 32 BC. That same year, Octavian announced he had obtained Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins at the temple in the Roman Forum, breaching every religious convention of the city, and read selected passages aloud in the Curia. The passages confirmed, he said, that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, and that he acknowledged Caesarion as Caesar's true son. Whether the will was authentic, doctored, or invented, it did its work. The Senate stripped Antony of his consulship and his future commands. Then they declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. A foreign war, a defense of Rome against an Egyptian queen. Octavian had reframed a Roman civil war as a national emergency. Roman soldiers would not have to choose between Roman commanders. They would only have to defend the Republic against a woman. The fleets met off the western coast of Greece on September 2, 31st BC, near the headland of Actium, in the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf. Antony's fleet was larger, but undermanned. Malaria had hollowed out his rowing crews through the long summer in the swamps, and desertions had stripped his Italian officers. His warships were heavy quinqueremes, reinforced with iron-banded prows. Octavian's admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa commanded smaller, faster Liburnian galleys. Agrippa was the better naval commander by a long margin and had already cleared the seas of Sextus Pompeius 5 years earlier at Naulochus. The battle dragged through the morning into hard northwesterly wind. The two lines closed at midday. By afternoon, Agrippa's wing had outflanked Antony's left, and the center was buckling. At some point in the afternoon, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 Egyptian ships, which had been held in reserve behind the line carrying the war treasury, broke through a gap in the lines and ran south under full canvas. Antony followed her in a smaller ship. He left the fleet. He abandoned his own legions on shore. The remaining ships fought on, then surrendered or burned. Within a week, his land army of 19 legions, commanded by Publius Canidius Crassus, defected to Octavian without a battle. Canidius fled to Egypt to bring Antony the news in person. The final act played out in Alexandria across the next 10 months, and Octavian's careful pace through those months tells you exactly what he needed from this war. He did not rush. He communicated with Cleopatra separately from Antony, through her tutor Euphronius and the freedman Thyrsus. He let messengers carry hints that she could save herself, save her children, save Egypt, if she would only deliver Antony to him. He wanted her cooperative. He wanted her breathing. He needed her in his triumph more than he needed her dead, because the entire political story of the past decade, the story of Rome rescued from an Eastern queen, required that queen to walk the sacred way in chains. Antony died first. In late July of 30th BC, with Octavian's troops already in the city's eastern suburbs near the Canopic Gate, he led one final cavalry sortie that scattered Octavian's outriders, returned to the palace in elated spirits, and discovered that his entire fleet had rowed out to surrender that same hour. His Egyptian troops melted away. He received false word from a runner that Cleopatra had killed herself. He retired to his quarters, called for his armor-bearer Eros, and ordered the man to kill him. Eros drew his sword, turned the blade on himself, and fell dead at Antony's feet. Antony fell on his own sword. The cut was botched. He lay bleeding on the floor of his apartment, calling for someone to finish him, and no one would. The household had already fled. Cleopatra had locked herself with two waiting women, Iris and Charmian, inside her unfinished mausoleum near the Temple of Isis. It was a stone tower whose upper window was the only opening she had not sealed against the Romans. Antony, dying, was carried to the foot of the building on a litter by his last surviving attendants. They lowered ropes from the window. Plutarch describes the scene with the painful precision of a man who has consulted the eyewitness account of the physician Olympus. The three women heaving the wounded general up the outside of the tower by hand, the queen and her servants gasping at the dead weight, his blood running in dark threads down the limestone face of the wall. He died on the upper floor in her arms, asking for a cup of wine. Octavian heard the news within hours and moved at once. He could not allow her to follow Antony. He sent his officer Proculeius and the freedman Epaphroditus to take her alive. Proculeius spoke to her through the barred door of the mausoleum, distracting her with negotiation, while another officer, Gaius Cornelius Gallus, the poet and later the first Roman prefect of Egypt, kept her in conversation. While they spoke, Proculeius climbed a ladder around the back of the building and dropped through the upper window with two soldiers. She drew a dagger from her girdle when she saw him. He caught her wrist and disarmed her. He searched her clothing for poison. She was placed under guard inside her own palace. The mausoleum was surrounded. Octavian came to her in person on a date Plutarch does not give, but places shortly after Antony's burial. The meeting is one of the strange scenes of the ancient world. A 33-year-old Roman who had just won the world, sitting across from a 39-year-old queen who had run the Eastern Mediterranean for 2 decades, both of them perfectly aware of what the other wanted, neither of them able to say it. She had lost her composure for the public part of the audience. Her clothing was torn. Her face bore the marks of her own fingernails. She had been beating her chest until the bruises spread under her collarbones. She had been refusing food. She produced, when he entered, a packet of letters Caesar had once written her, old correspondence she had kept for 20 years, and read fragments aloud while weeping. Plutarch notes the moment her mind began working again. She tested him. She presented a falsified inventory of her remaining treasure. Her steward, Seleucus, present as a witness, corrected the list out loud. She struck him in the face. Octavian smiled at the performance and left. She understood the smile. She had seen Caesar smile that way before he gave an order to a clerk. Octavian had made his decision. She was going to Rome. She asked permission to make offerings at Antony's tomb. Octavian granted it. She went, dressed in mourning, and poured wine onto the new stone. She bathed. She ordered a meal of figs from the Delta. The basket of figs was searched at the door of her chamber by a Roman guard. He found nothing. She dined. She wrote a letter to Octavian and sent it by hand. He read it and understood what it meant. He ran his men to her chambers. He was too late. The mechanism remains contested even now. Plutarch lists the versions current in his sources: a snake, the Egyptian cobra, the asp, the uraeus that crowned every pharaoh, smuggled into her chamber inside the basket of figs, hidden beneath the fruit, a hollow comb filled with poison, a pinprick in her arm with a venomous needle. Galen, writing a century later, mentions a self-inflicted wound on the arm with a poisoned pin. Plutarch writes that 2 faint marks were found on her arm and nothing else, and that a faint trail of slime was seen on the windowsill that may have been a serpent's track. Dio reports the same. The physician Olympus, who had attended her until that morning, wrote an account of the end which has not survived to us. Her 2 women died with her. Iras went first, collapsing at her feet. Charmian was still arranging the diadem on the queen's brow when the Roman guards burst through the door. One of them, seeing what had happened, shouted at her, "Charmian, is this well done?" She answered, "Very well done, as becomes the descendant of so many kings." Then she fell beside her mistress. Cleopatra was found on her golden couch, in the full regalia of Isis, the linen sheath, the diadem, the cobra of the uraeus on her forehead, golden bracelets snake-shaped at her wrists. She had dressed for death as she had dressed for power, on her own terms, in her own image, as a goddess, not a captive. She was 39 years old. Octavian, the sources agree, was furious. He had posted guards. He had sent in Scilly. Suetonius identifies them by their North African tribal name, snake handlers who claimed an immunity to venom and were brought in to suck poison from a wound to try to save her in case she had done exactly what she had done. He had used the threat of harm to her children as leverage. None of it had worked. She had outplayed him on the only board left to her. He had her embalmed by Egyptian priests and buried beside Antony, as the will Antony had left in Rome had requested. It was the one concession he made to her dead. He still held everything else. Egypt's treasury was now Rome's treasury. The annual grain shipments out of Alexandria, 20 million modi a year, would feed the city of Rome for the next 3 centuries and underwrite the political stability of the empire. He had Caesarion hunted down within weeks. The boy, 17 years old, had been sent south toward Berenice on the Red Sea with a tutor named Rhodan, intended to escape to India. Rhodan was bribed. He persuaded Caesarion to turn back. Octavian's advisor, Arrius Didymus, reportedly quoted a line of Homer to settle the matter. "It is not good that there should be too many Caesars." The boy was killed. The twins and Ptolemy Philadelphus were marched to Rome in chains and handed over to Octavia, Antony's discarded Roman wife, to raise alongside her own children by him. Octavia, by every account, did the work without complaint. He had everything, except the one thing his triumph required, the breathing body of the queen, walking proof that Rome had broken her. In August of 2019 BC, he celebrated 3 triumphs over 3 consecutive days, for victories in Illyria, at Actium, and in Egypt. The route ran the customary 1.5 miles from the Campus Martius to the Capitoline. He rode the triumphal chariot, face painted red, a slave standing behind him with a golden crown held above his head, whispering, according to tradition, the formula that reminded him he was mortal. On the Egyptian day, the 3rd day, the crowd watched the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, paraded in chains too heavy for 10-year-old wrists. Dio and Suetonius both record their appearance. The chains were gold. The weight was real. And then, on a litter carried by slaves, the crowd saw the queen. Not the queen. An effigy of the queen. A statue or wax figure reclining on a couch, an asp coiled around one arm. Dio specifies the pose. Rome had built its victory parade around a doll. The woman herself was sealed inside her mausoleum in Alexandria, beside Antony, exactly as she had arranged. Octavian had won the war. He had taken Egypt. He had killed her son. He had taken her remaining children. He had everything except her body in his parade. And so he commissioned a sculptor to provide a substitute. The figure on the litter, with the sacred snake of Egypt at its arm, was Octavian admitting in public, in the only language the triumph allowed, that Cleopatra had taken the ending from him. The crowd cheered anyway. They cheered the statue. They threw flowers at it. The machine substituted representation for reality and kept moving, because the alternative was to admit that the ceremony had a hole in its center. This is the argument, stated as clearly as the evidence permits. The triumph was not a celebration. It was a technology of domination. It required the body of a defeated sovereign, present, breathing, humiliated, to teach Roman crowds and the watching provinces that no kingship existed outside Rome's permission. Without the body, the technology failed. And faced with that failure, Rome did not cancel the parade. It built a puppet. Cleopatra had read every page of the script. She had watched Iceni walk the same route at 17. She had stood in the crowd and memorized the faces. When her own turn came, she rewrote the last line. She turned the machine's hunger against itself by giving it nothing to chew on. The parade went forward. The temples sacrificed. The augurs read the entrails. And in every account that recorded the ceremony, the absence at its center was louder than any victory ever staged on those streets. The twin children of Antony and Cleopatra continued to walk in Roman society for the rest of their lives. Cleopatra Selene was eventually married to King Juba II of Mauritania and ruled a North African kingdom from Caesarea on the Algerian coast, where she minted coins bearing her mother's profile and the title Basilissa Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra, until her own death around 5 BC. The machine had killed the woman. The daughter wore the name on coinage Rome itself accepted. Before we cross into the final chapter of this story, to Zenobia, the queen who came 3 centuries later and forced Rome to stage the real thing, chains and gold and all, take a moment right now and look for the View Products button on your screen. The source book behind today's research is waiting there. It is the kind of volume that does not sit politely on a shelf. It changes the way you read every Roman history you touch afterward. It was the foundation of the script you are listening to. You need it. Beside it on the shelf, you will find a curated set of themed artifacts, pieces shaped after the empire we study, gathered specifically for the people who watch this channel. Open the shelf. Look at what is there. Then come back here. Because Zenobia's ending is not Cleopatra's ending. She did not escape. Rome got its body. Rome got its chains. Rome got the screaming crowd it had been denied at Actium. And the strangest part of the entire 300-year argument is what happened next. Because the parade worked, the queen walked, the crowd roared, and Rome still could not finish the story. Palmyra rose from the Syrian desert the way a fever rises from heat. Sudden, ornate, impossible to explain by the country around it. The city sat at the junction of caravan roads running from Rome to Persia and from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean coast. Its great colonnade stretched a mile across the basin, limestone columns the color of pale honey, each capital carved with acanthus leaves, brackets jutting out at shoulder height, where bronze statues of leading citizens had been mounted by public subscription. Its Temple of Bel rose 40 meters above the streets, sanctuary walls plated in bronze on the interior, doors gilded, ceiling beams cut from Lebanese cedar carried across 200 miles of desert by camel caravan. The air inside that temple at noon smelled of frankincense and the burned offerings the priests of Bel, Yarhibol, and Aglibol made twice a day. For 3 centuries the city had grown rich on tariffs charged on silk, ivory, pepper, and pearls passing through its customs houses. It was Roman in legal status. It was something else in practice. And in the middle of the 3rd century AD, the difference began to matter. Roman historians would later call that century the crisis. Between AD 235 and AD 284, the empire cycled through more than 50 emperors. Most were generals acclaimed by their own troops and dead within months. Legions marched on Rome. Legions marched on each other. The Rhine and Danube frontiers bled. Plague swept the empire from AD 249 to 262, what historians now call the Plague of Cyprian, after the bishop of Carthage, who described its symptoms, possibly a viral hemorrhagic fever that killed thousands a day at its peak in Alexandria and Rome. The coinage collapsed. The silver content of the Antoninianus fell from over 50% under Caracalla to barely 2% by the AD 260s, which meant prices ran wild, and tax revenue had to be collected increasingly in kind, in grain, in oil, in cloth, rather than in coin. In AD 251, the Emperor Decius was killed by the Goths at Abritus in the marshes of modern Bulgaria, the first sitting emperor to fall in battle against a foreign enemy. His body was never recovered. 9 years later, the Persians under Shapur captured the Emperor Valerian alive at the Battle of Edessa, the sitting Roman emperor taken in the field, paraded back to Bishapur in chains, used as a mounting block when Shapur climbed his horse. The rock reliefs at Nakshi Rustam still show the scene. Shapur on horseback, Valerian on his knees, with his wrist gripped by the Persian king. When Valerian finally died in captivity, Persian craftsmen reportedly skinned his body, dyed the hide red, and stuffed it as a trophy in a temple. The story comes from Lactantius, a Christian writer with reason to dwell on the indignity, but the underlying capture is confirmed by Shapur's own trilingual inscription at the Kabaye Zartosht. The empire fractured into three. The center held Italy. The west split off under a soldier emperor named Postumus to form what historians now call the Gallic Empire across Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Postumus minted his own coinage at Cologne with his own image and the legend Restitutor Galli RVM, restorer of the Gallic provinces. And in the east, into the vacuum left by Valerian's capture, stepped a Palmyrene nobleman named Septimius Odaenathus. Odaenathus was Zenobia's husband. He was the Ras of Palmyra, a Semitic title approximating senator or chief, a hereditary distinction in his family. The gens Septimia, who had been granted Roman citizenship under Septimius Severus a generation earlier. He commanded the Palmyrene army, a mixed force of Arab light cavalry, Syrian foot archers from the Horan and the Orontes Valley, and the heavy cataphracts modeled on Parthian and later Sassanid practice. He drove the Persians back across the Euphrates after Valerian's capture in 2 campaigns over AD 260 and 261. He recovered most of the eastern provinces. He sacked the outer suburbs of the Persian capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris. He recovered the Roman war standards Shapur had taken at Edessa, the silver eagles of the legions, the most sacred objects in the Roman military religion. Rome awarded him the title Corrector Totius Orientis, corrector of the entire East, an honorific that in practice was indistinguishable from independent sovereignty. He was also given the rank of Dux Romanorum and acclaimed King of Kings, MLK, on his own Palmyrene inscriptions. The title was given because Rome had no other option. The Emperor Gallienus, son of the captured Valerian, was trying to hold Italy and the Balkans against Gothic invasions and could spare neither troops nor attention for the East. Odaenathus was the only force in the region capable of holding the frontier, and both sides knew it. He was murdered in AD 267 or 268, along with his eldest son Hieron from his first marriage, at a banquet. The location is given variously as near Heraclea Pontica on the Black Sea coast or at Emesa in Syria. The sources cannot agree. The assassin is named as Maionius, identified by different writers as a cousin or a nephew of Odaenathus. The motives offered range from a personal quarrel over precedence during a hunt. The Augusta source says Maionius had killed an animal that the heir apparent Hieron claimed first, to a Roman-backed conspiracy out of fear of Palmyrene independence. One late tradition implicates Zenobia herself in arranging the killing to clear the way for her own son. Most modern historians read that thread as character assassination written backwards, the kind of slur Rome attached by reflex to inconvenient queens. What is certain is that when Odenathus and Heron died on the same night, Zenobia took control of Palmyra as regent for her young son Vabalithus, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, while Maionius was killed within days by the Palmyrene guard. She did not behave as a regent. Her name in Aramaic was Bat Zabai, daughter of Zabai. The Palmyrene tomb inscriptions of her own family call her Septimia Zenobia. She was, by the description, in the Historia Augusta, a source compiled in the late 4th century, riddled with invention, but the most detailed portrait we have. A woman with dark skin, brilliant white teeth, and eyes the writer calls black and full of fire. She rode horseback among her soldiers. She walked at the head of her columns on foot for miles at a stretch when the army was moving across rough country. She drank with her generals at the long marble tables of the Palmyrene court, mixing watered wine in the Greek style. She hunted lions in the Syrian foothills with the bow. She kept a court philosopher, Cassius Longinus, one of the most respected intellectuals of the 3rd century, a man who had taught for years in Athens, written a treatise on rhetoric, and corresponded with Plotinus. Around him she gathered grammarians, theologians, and the bishop Paul of Samosata, whose unorthodox theological positions on the nature of Christ she protected at Antioch even after he was excommunicated by a synod of bishops in AD 268. In AD 270, her general Septimius Zabdas marched a Palmyrene army of 70,000 south into Egypt. The Roman prefect Tenagino Probus, returning from naval operations against pirates in the eastern Mediterranean, was killed in the fighting near Babylon on the Nile, the fortified town that would later become the core of medieval Cairo. He had been ambushed in the hills and reportedly took his own life rather than be captured. Egypt fell. Cleopatra's Old Kingdom, the richest province in the Roman world, the grain country whose harvests had fed the city of Rome for 3 centuries, was now Palmyrene. A garrison of 50,000 Palmyrene troops was stationed there under a general named Timagenes, a Greek-Egyptian who had joined Zabdas during the campaign and helped open the gates of Alexandria from inside. Within months, Zabdas pushed north into Asia Minor and took provincial capitals one after another: Ancyra, modern Ankara; Tyana, the birthplace of the philosopher Apollonius of Tyana, who had died only a generation earlier, and whose reputation as a holy man Zenobia is reported to have respected, sparing the city. Chalcedon, on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, looking directly across the strait at Byzantium. To the south, she secured Arabia, including the Roman legionary fortress at Bostra, where the garrison of the 3rd Legion Cyrenaica went over to her with little resistance. The temple of Jupiter Hammon at Bostra was burned in the takeover, an act Aurelian's propaganda would later cite as proof of Zenobia's contempt for Roman religion. At the height of her reach, she controlled territory stretching from central Anatolia to the cataracts of the Nile, every Roman holding east of the Hellespont and south of the Taurus Mountains. 1/3 of the empire. She had coins minted at the imperial mint at Antioch and at Alexandria. The early issues show Vabalithus with the title Rex Consul Imperator Dux Romanorum, king, consul, commander, leader of the Romans, a careful Latin phrasing that respected Roman precedents and acknowledged the reigning emperor in Italy. The later issues, struck after AD 272, dropped the Roman deference completely. Vabalithus is named Augustus on the obverse. Zenobia is named Augusta on the reverse, with the legend Septimia Zenobia AVG and her own diadem on her brow. The minting at Alexandria, in tetradrachms of Egyptian standard, dates her reign years separately from any acknowledged Roman emperor. She had stopped negotiating and begun declaring. She seems to have understood that the story mattered as much as the army. She claimed descent from Cleopatra VII, a claim no Roman source independently corroborates and no Egyptian record confirms, but which she circulated deliberately. It rooted her empire in the ancient royal house Augustus had broken 3 centuries earlier. It told the Greek-speaking East that the line of the Ptolemies had not ended. It told her own subjects that they were not rebels against Rome. They were the restoration of an older order Rome had interrupted. Egyptian Coptic tradition later remembered her with affection. So did the Manichaean communities along the Syrian trade routes, whose founder Mani had begun his preaching in the same decade. In Rome, the new emperor was Lucius Domitius Aurelianus. Aurelian was a soldier from the Pannonian provinces along the Danube, of obscure family, possibly born near Sirmium in modern Serbia in AD 214. He had clawed his way through the cavalry commands to the purple in September of AD 270 after the army murdered his predecessor Quintillus, who had ruled for 17 days. He was disciplined where the 3rd century had been chaotic. He was methodical where his predecessors had been improvisational. He executed officers who disobeyed him and rewarded those who did not. His soldiers called him manu ad ferrum, hand on the iron, for his habit of personal violence in discipline cases. Posterity would call him restitutor orbis, restorer of the world, because over 4 campaign seasons he reunified the fractured empire, ringed the city of Rome with a new defensive wall whose course is still visible today. 12 miles of brick-faced concrete, 8 meters tall, completed in just under 5 years, and rebuilt the imperial coinage on a more stable footing. In late summer, AD 271, he settled the Danube. In spring AD 272, he turned his army east. His campaign was a study in operational sequence. He marched through Asia Minor, recovering the cities Zabdas had taken, mostly without significant fighting. Tiana opened its gates after he promised, and reportedly kept, despite his soldiers' demand for plunder, a guarantee not to sack it. The Historia Augusta gives Aurelian's words to his troops: "We make war on Zenobia. Spare the Tyaneans." Whether the speech is invention or not, the city was preserved. He crossed the Taurus Mountains and descended toward Antioch through the Cilician Gates, the same pass Alexander had used 600 years earlier. The Palmyrene army's defining weapon was its cataphracts, cavalry sheathed head to foot in iron scales, small overlapping plates riveted to leather, mounted on horses also armored in scale or lamellar, carrying the contus, a 4-meter lance gripped two-handed, no shield, the rider's stability maintained by a high pommel and high cantle on the saddle. Against light cavalry, they were close to unstoppable. Against disciplined infantry that could hold formation and weight, they had a fatal weakness: the armor. Inside the scales, in a Syrian summer where ground temperatures crossed 45 degrees Celsius, a man and a horse cooked. The iron held heat the way a kettle does. A long pursuit broke them more reliably than any countercharge. Aurelian had been a cavalry officer his entire career. He understood every gram of that equipment. At the Battle of Imae outside Antioch, in late spring AD 272, he ordered his own Dalmatian and Mauritanian light cavalry to feign retreat the moment the cataphracts charged. The armored horsemen, committed to their lances, could not stop. They pursued. They galloped. Aurelian's cavalry led them across miles of broken ground in the heat of the Orontes Valley, the river running brown and slow on their right hand, dust rising in a curtain behind them. The horses began to founder. The riders began to slump inside their armor. When the cataphracts finally turned to ride back, exhausted and disordered, Aurelian's infantry, which had held its ground throughout the maneuver, wheeled into them with clubs as well as swords. Zosimus specifies the clubs. The legionaries had been issued staves and ordered to use blunt weapons against the iron plate, smashing rather than cutting, knocking the cataphracts off their horses where they could be finished on the ground with the dagger through the eye slits of the helmets. The Palmyrene line broke. Zabdas pulled back to Antioch and then to Emesa, modern Homs, where he tried to fight a second battle on more favorable ground in front of the city. The sources give him 70,000 men there against Aurelian's smaller but more cohesive force. Aurelian crushed him again. The same maneuver, the same outcome. Zenobia's main field army was now gone. She was, according to Zosimus, present at Emesa during the fighting, watching from the city walls. She fell back on Palmyra itself. The city was walled, supplied, and defended. Aurelian followed across the open desert from Emesa, a march of more than 100 miles through country where his supply columns were harassed continuously by the desert tribes of the Tanakh and the Saracens, who had been paid by Palmyra to do exactly this work. Aurelian responded by buying off the tribes, paying gold to the same chiefs who had been paid by Palmyra, and offering them more. The harassment stopped. He arrived under the walls of Palmyra in the late summer of AD 272 and began the siege. A letter attributed to him in the Historia Augusta, almost certainly literary invention but reflecting authentic propaganda, describes the city's defenses. Ballistae mounted on the walls, scorpions throwing iron darts. Fire and stones rained down on his men. Even the women fight. He supposedly wrote, "I cannot complete this war without the help of the gods." Zenobia waited inside the city for relief that did not come. The Persians, watching from across the Euphrates, did not commit. Sassanid king Hormizd Pharnaendri had succeeded Shapur the year before and had his own succession to consolidate against his brother Bahram. He sent encouraging letters. He sent no troops. As food began to thin inside Palmyra and the cisterns ran low, Zenobia made her move. She mounted a fast dromedary. Zosimus is specific that it was a camel, not a horse, faster across desert sand for a sustained run, and rode east at night with a small escort, heading for the Euphrates. If she could cross the river, she could reach the Persian court at Ctesiphon, plead in person, perhaps return at the head of a Sassanid army. Persian boats had been arranged in advance to ferry her across at a bend in the river south of modern Deir ez-Zor. Aurelian's cavalry caught her at the riverbank. She was about to step into the boat. According to Zosimus, the Roman patrol had been tracking the column for 2 days through the desert, by the dust it raised at dawn. She was brought back to Aurelian's camp under guard. Palmyra surrendered shortly after. Aurelian initially treated the city with restraint. He installed a garrison of 600 archers under a Roman officer named Sandario, took hostages from the leading families, confiscated the temple gold of Bel, and left. He turned his column west and began the march back to Europe to deal with new threats on the Danube. Then, after he had withdrawn most of his army past Antioch, the Palmyrenes rose. A man named Apseus orchestrated the revolt and proclaimed a kinsman of Zenobia, a man named Antiochus, as the new ruler. They killed Sandario and his 600 archers. Aurelian, then near the Hellespont, with his army strung out along the road, turned around and marched back across the same desert he had crossed months earlier. The march was forced. He covered the distance in less than half the normal time. The second arrival was different. He took the city by storm in the spring of AD 273. He let his troops sack it. The colonnade was wrecked. Statues were pulled down from their brackets and broken on the pavement. The Temple of Bel was stripped of its gold and bronze, the cedar ceiling beams pried out and carried away. The mint was carried off to Antioch and reinstalled there. Cassius Longinus, the philosopher of the court, was executed along with the other advisors who had served Zenobia, Zosimus and the Historia. Augusta both report that Longinus met his end with composure, consoling the men weeping around him with arguments from his own writings on the brevity of human life. Antiochus, the puppet emperor, was treated with contempt and spared as too unimportant to kill. Aurelian reportedly said the man was not worthy of execution. The city's population was reduced by killing and deportation. Palmyra never recovered. A small Roman garrison camp continued at the site under Diocletian and later emperors, but the great trading metropolis was finished. The ruins stood in the desert for 17 centuries before another empire, a self-declared caliphate calling itself the Islamic State, returned to them in AD 2015 and finished what Aurelian had started, dynamiting the Temple of Bel and beheading the 82-year-old archaeologist Khalid al-Assad in the city's main square for refusing to reveal where artifacts had been hidden. But Zenobia was alive, and this was the moment the entire machine had been engineered for. Aurelian celebrated his triumph in Rome in AD 274, after he had also recovered the Gallic Empire from its last emperor, Tetricus, at the Battle of Chalons. The sources describe a parade calibrated for maximum spectacle. The procession began at the Campus Martius, wound through the Velabrum past the temples of Castor and Pollux, and climbed the sacred way to the Capitoline. 20 elephants walked in line. The first elephants Romans had seen in a triumph since the African campaigns of the Republic. 200 wild beasts from the eastern provinces, lions, tigers, giraffes, antelope, ostriches, moved in cages on rolling carts. 800 pairs of gladiators marched. 1,600 prisoners came after them. Gothic, Sarmatian, Frankish, Vandal, Alemanni, Suevi, Saxon captives, each labeled with a placard naming their tribe. Tetricus, the former Gallic emperor, walked in trousers and a saffron cloak, the Roman crowd's mark of the conquered Gaul. His son walked beside him in the same costume. Then came Zenobia. She was not in rags. She was the opposite. She was weighted down with jewels, bracelets at her wrists and biceps, necklaces in layered tiers down to her waist, earrings hanging to her shoulders, a crown so heavy that the sources report a slave walked behind her, supporting it from beneath with both hands, and her chains were gold, not iron, gold, with links thick enough that other slaves had to walk on either side of her, bearing the weight of the chain itself off the pavement so she could move at all. This is the detail to slow down on. Iron chains were for slaves and condemned criminals. Gold chains were for queens, specifically for queens being displayed as conquered wealth rather than degraded as common prisoners. The distinction was not mercy. It was message. Aurelian wanted the crowd to see luxury subjugated, not just a human being humbled. He wanted them to look at the rings on her fingers and the chains on her ankles and the gold around her throat, and understand them as Rome's contents now, drawn from her treasury into his. He was telling them, look at what the East called power. It is in our parade today. We are wearing it on the prisoner. The gold was heavier than iron. The Historia Augusta, and it is worth remembering that this source is unreliable in the specifics, while often capturing the propagandist's tone, reports that she had to stop along the route to rest. that the weight of her own jewels brought her to a halt repeatedly between the Forum and the Capitoline. The image that produces is one Rome wanted produced, the Empress of the East, draped in her own gold, brought to a standstill in the middle of the city's main street by the burden of her own former glory, in front of a crowd that had waited 3 years to see this exact sight. The route was lined with people on both sides, 4 and 5 deep, leaning out of upper windows, standing on rooftops. Children were lifted onto their fathers' shoulders. Rome had its body. It had its living queen. It had the spectacle that Octavian, 3 centuries earlier, had been forced to manufacture with a wax figure on a litter. And then it had to decide what to do with her. This is where the story splits, and where the final and most insidious move of the machine becomes visible. The standard ending for a major enemy displayed in a Roman triumph was death. Strangulation in the Tullianum at the foot of the Capitoline, while the triumphal chariot continued up to the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, above. The Tullianum was a circular underground chamber, whose ceiling was the floor of the room above, whose only entrance was a hole in that ceiling through which prisoners were lowered by rope. Vercingetorix had been strangled there in 46 BC after 6 years in a cell. Jugurtha, paraded by Marius in 104 BC, had been thrown into the same chamber and starved to death over 6 days, dying naked and laughing, the cold of the stone cell having driven him insane. The Macedonian king Perseus, paraded by Aemilius Paulus in 167 BC, was kept alive as a curiosity but died in Roman custody within 2 years, possibly deliberately deprived of sleep by his guards, who beat on the door of his cell at night until his mind gave way. The machine's pattern pointed in one direction. After the spectacle, disposal. For Zenobia, the sources cannot agree on what happened. Zosimus, writing in the early 6th century from earlier sources, now lost, chiefly the pagan historian Eunapius, suggests she died around the time of the triumph. His phrasing is ambiguous in the Greek. Scholars argue over whether he means she died in transit, on the journey from Syria to Rome, possibly by refusing food on the ship across the Aegean, or in the immediate aftermath of the parade itself. Either reading sits within the standard fate of triumph prisoners and within everything Rome had done to almost every previous major captive of its wars. Some scholars suggest she may have died of an illness contracted during the siege of Palmyra, weakened by months of reduced rations and then by the long journey west. Others read Zosimus as implying suicide by starvation in the manner of certain Greek queens of the Hellenistic period. The Historia Augusta tells a different story. In its account, Aurelian, moved by her dignity at the parade, or persuaded by the Senate, or convinced that killing a woman who had spoken Greek and read philosophy in his presence would damage his own reputation, spared her. He granted her a villa at Tibur, the modern town of Tivoli, in the Sabine Hills about 30 kilometers east of Rome, on land that had once belonged to the Emperor Hadrian's vast country estate. She lived there for years. Her daughters married into the Roman senatorial nobility. The source names no husbands, but later medieval traditions inserted candidates. Her descendants are claimed by the source as still living at the time of the text's composition in the late 4th century. In this version, she became a respectable Roman matron, a curiosity hosted at dinner parties for her learning and her Eastern origins, fading from political relevance into a long, quiet, irrelevant old age beside the cascading waters of the Aniene River. These two stories cannot both be true. A woman cannot die at the triumph and also grow old in Tivoli. Here is what matters. Rome wins regardless of which story you believe. The benefit is not accidental. If she died, Rome demonstrates that its military power is total and its treatment of rebels is absolute. The parade is followed by the expected conclusion. The cycle of the machine closes. The message to the next would-be Eastern queen is final. This is what happens to you. If she lived in a villa at Tivoli, Rome demonstrates something more subtle, but at least as powerful. Its capacity for civilized magnanimity. The barbarian queen, brought low by Roman arms, is educated into Roman civilization. Her bloodline is absorbed into the senatorial class. She is not destroyed but transformed, converted from a rival empress into a Roman matron, which in Roman ideological terms is a more complete victory than execution. Rome did not just defeat her. Rome made her Roman. Either way, Rome controls the story. Either she is proof of Rome's power to destroy, or she is proof of Rome's power to absorb. The machine delivers its lesson regardless of which version a reader picks up, which means the machine does not need to resolve the question. The ambiguity itself is the final tool. Her own voice does not survive. Not in any text, not in any inscription that speaks as Zenobia speaking. 2 letters attributed to her appear in the Historia Augusta, a defiant reply to Aurelian's surrender demand, in which she compares herself to Cleopatra and says she would rather die than submit, and a brief note to Cassius Longinus, and both are almost certainly literary inventions of the source, written centuries after the fact. She appears in her own coins, the Augusta on bronze and silver, struck at Antioch and Alexandria, staring out with the steady gaze of imperial authority, hair coiled at the back, diadem across the brow, the crescent moon of the Levantine goddesses sometimes added at her shoulder. That is the closest we come to her unmediated face. Everything else is Rome's story, about a woman Rome needed to convert into a story. Aurelian himself did not last much longer. In AD 275, while marching east on a planned campaign against Persia, a campaign that would have settled the eastern frontier in Rome's favor for a generation, he was murdered near Cenefrurium in Thrace by a conspiracy of his own officers. His secretary, a man named Eros, had forged a list of officers Aurelian supposedly intended to execute in order to settle a personal grievance. The officers, seeing their own names on the forged list, struck first. Aurelian, the restorer of the world, was killed by his own men over a clerical lie. He was 50 years old. His successor Tacitus, named by the Senate after a 6-month interregnum, ruled for less than a year. The crisis continued for another 9 years before Diocletian finally closed it in AD 284. 3 women, 3 encounters with the same machine. Boudica, who never fed it at all. She died on the heath, or in her tent, with poison in her blood, or fever in her chest. And the legions stood over an empty cart, looking for a body that was not there. The wound she opened in Rome's narrative never fully closed. Every Roman who told the story of Britain had to tell the story of the flogging that started it. Cleopatra, who dressed herself as a goddess and locked the door behind her. She denied Rome the one component its triumph could not manufacture. The crowd cheered a statue carved by a sculptor working from descriptions. The absence at the center of Octavian's greatest parade was so large it had to be hidden behind painted wax. Zenobia, who could not escape. She was caught at the river. She walked in gold chains through the streets of Rome with the screaming crowd Rome had been promised at last. And still, the story of what happened after the parade ended could not be settled. The empire could not finish her. It produced 2 endings, kept both on the shelf, and left her permanently unresolved. The machine consumed all 3. It took Boudica's daughters and her tribe's land. It took Cleopatra's Egypt, her son Caesarion, her dynasty, her treasury, her grain, the names her surviving children carried as adults. It took Zenobia's Palmyra, her library, her philosopher Longinus, her city's stones. It fed all of it into the engine of Roman permanence and turned it into roads, walls, aqueducts, and the long centuries of the Pax. What it could not entirely take were the stories. Boudica is why every schoolchild in Britain knows the word Iceni. Cleopatra is the most written about woman of the ancient world, and the cobra at her arm belongs to her, not to the wax figure Octavian commissioned for his parade. Zenobia stares out from her coins in display cases across 100 museums, the Augusta on bronze, sovereign and intact, the face the empire could chain but could not erase. The machine has been gone for 16 centuries. The names are still here. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If this story moved you, if it sat in your chest the way it sat in ours through the research and the writing, please subscribe to the channel, drop a like on this video, and send it to someone who needs to hear these three women named in the same hour. Stories at this depth take real work to build, and every share is what keeps the project alive. You've just watched another premium documentary by Romanus, your home of the Roman Empire on YouTube. Now, look at the video appearing on your screen right now. Click it. Watch it. The descent into the dark corridors of history does not end at this door. The next one is already open, and the story waiting behind it is one you will not be able to walk away from.